Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Small or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Gesshoo, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Dani.
Small, Chapter 9. Absolutely not, Sarah said as she stood in the middle of Petra's office, staring Isadora down in challenge. Sarah, please be reasonable, Isadora said with an uncharacteristically impatient huff. It really is the best option, and were it not for the accident, I think you and I both know you would agree. They'd been at this for nearly 10 minutes, with Sarah refusing to budge, and Isadora was bit like an addict when it came to being away from the necropolis and her myriad experiments and studies. The longer she was required elsewhere, and without an expensive glass of whiskey to take the edge off, the more irritable she became, the more she began to itch. Sarah knew this, but still. Must I repeat myself yet again? Sarah barked it like an order, and Petra snorted from her desk. Instantly, the woman flinched, clearly having not intended to make such a sound. But it was out in the air, tugging sharply at Sarah's last nerve, and she turned a glare towards Petra that, on her best day, could have sparked the woman aflame. But today was not her best day. Yeah, Sarah, I don't think the whole intimidation thing is going to work today. Yarrow's voice floated through her mind. Something about the small, soiled-covered child attached to your hand, maybe? You know, the one currently digging a wedgie out of her butt. A small huff of annoyance sounded from Sarah's side as she looked down to see Tally's hand, still dirty from planting trees, dangling from her own as the girl leaned over and, with her other hand, dug at her underwear through her pants. Sarah squeezed Tally's hand, hoping it would convey without words the importance of decorum in this moment, if for nothing else than to summon the proper air of authority. But Tally only squeezed her hand back absent-mindedly, never once ceasing her digging. Oh, must be one hell of a wedgie, Ophelia laughed. She rolled her eyes when Sarah's glare turned on her and reached out to wordlessly drag Tally away from her. The biddies quickly encircled the girl to protect her from view as they helped her tend to her issue. In a matter of seconds, 2 or 3 very awkward, silent seconds, while Sarah fumed and avoided gazes, and Isadora and Petra rocked silently in their places, Tally bounded back out of the biddy circle and returned to Sarah's side. "It's okay, everybody," she said dramatically. "I'm fine now, okay?" Sarah cleared her throat. Would the goddess grant her no reprieve? "Yes, thank you," she said, more to the biddies than to Tally. Her wee girl still nodded fiercely and chirped out a bright, "Welcome!" Sarah turned her attention back to Petra, summoning every ounce of influence she could muster into her spine and gaze, and asked, "Now, was there something you wished to say, Petra?" "Only that you're acting as if Isadora is being the unreasonable one," Petra said, and braced her shoulders in a fashion that told Sarah she was about to be sided against, when in fact you are. "Unreasonable," Tally sing-songed, swinging back and forth from Sarah's hand. Sarah did her best to ignore her. It wasn't easy, nor clearly was it a simple task for the other women in the room. Still, everyone tried, to their credit. "How is it unreasonable to protect a child?" Sarah demanded to know. She nearly melted into the floor when Petra's response came, capped with an eye roll. Sarah, come on, she said. Look, I respect that you are being cautious. After what happened with the Salva, I can imagine your unease at having to return to the necropolis with Tally in tow. But try to be reasonable here. We already have the designated lab there, one you had designed specifically for the required acoustics of bond exposure and analysis, which means we wouldn't have to spend time replicating those acoustics elsewhere. And I think we can all agree that carrying Tally down to the lab is a simpler task than Isadora having to load up her instruments and research to lug elsewhere. But the risk is minimal, if not moot, so long as a sharp eye is kept on Tally, Petra said before Sarah could launch again into all the reasons it was unsafe. Sarah, we can sleep her if it will set you at ease. But I'm not sheepy, Tally objected, and Sarah sighed. Tally, she said, then lowered down to one knee. Would you please go with your sisters and wash up while I finish here? It was the third time she attempted to send Tally off since their initial arrival at Petra's office, but each time Tally had refused to be separated from her Sarah. The first refusal was followed by the open-mouthed threat of a powerful scream, so Sarah had quickly softened her edges and posed her idea as more of a request than an order. Still, Tally had refused. So Sarah had hauled her into the meeting while Abigail, Adil, Khalida, and Rael had been shuffled along to an empty room down the hall to wait for a decision to be made. This time, Tally's swift refusal didn't come. Instead, she rocked from hip to hip and chewed on her bottom lip as if mulling it over. Then, can I bring Petwa? Sarah forced herself not to react to Petra's smug chuckle as it drifted over her shoulder and poked at her ear. No, my love, she said. I'm sorry. Petra needs to stay here to speak with me and Isadora, but Abigail will be with you. How does that sound? She can help you wash the dirt from your hands. Tally continued to chew her lip, her beautiful big eyes flitting back and forth between Sarah and Petra behind the desk. She then surprised Sarah by crooking her little hand between them, motioning for Sarah to come closer for a secret. Sarah shuffled a bit closer and leaned in, letting Tally press her cold little nose right to her ear. I don't want to be sleeped, my Sarah, she whispered, and Sarah sighed. Come here, she said, and drew Tally into a warm embrace, uncaring of their audience. She'd been made to stand and endure it while Tally pulled a wedgie from her behind, so a gentle hug was nothing. Sarah kissed Tally's ear. No matter what happens, I will be with you, and you will always be safe with me. You understand? Tally nodded over her shoulder, then wriggled herself out of Sarah's embrace. She patted around Petra's desk and held her hand up to the woman, crooking her fingers again to communicate she wanted Petra to come closer. Petra frowned, clearly confused, but leaned over the side of the chair anyway. When she was close enough, Tally cupped her small hands around her mouth and whispered into Petra's ear. Sarah couldn't make out what was being said, but she did note the subtle rise of Petra's eyebrows in response to it, and instantly her chest was burning with curiosity. Very well, soldier, Petra said as she straightened into her chair again. She gave Tally a serious nod, which the small girl returned, funnily enough, and then Tally was off again. Sarah watched as her tiny soulmate bopped back around the desk and made her way over to Isadora this time, much to everyone's surprise. Once again, she crooked her little fingers for Isadora to come closer, and as if helpless to resist, the woman dropped right to one knee and leaned in. Tally cupped her hands around her mouth again and whispered in Isadora's ear. A second later, Isadora's lips twitched with a tame smile. Certainly, Isadora said, and Tally covered her mouth and giggled. What are you scheming? Sarah finally asked, unable to hold her tongue any longer. But Tally only made a dramatic show of zipping her lips closed, locking them with an invisible key, and tossing that key over her shoulder, lost to time and air. Sarah sighed and held out her hand. Fine. Would you like me to take you to your sisters now? I want Ophi to take me, Tally said, and Sarah almost rolled her eyes at the ridiculous burst of joy and affection that spilled through the Biddybond from Ophelia. Very well, then. Hugs for Tally? Sarah did roll her eyes this time, though much as had been the case with Petra and Isadora, she found she could not help smiling at the girl. Come on, then, she said, and dropped into a squat. Tally skipped right into Sarah's arms and planted 5 quick little sloppy kisses all over Sarah's cheek. That's 5 kisses, Sarah, so only 5 minutes. Hey? Once again, a snort sounded from behind Sarah, but Sarah paid Petra no mind this time. She simply allowed herself to enjoy her ridiculous soulmate's lack of professionalism, even if it was bordering on proper mortification, and nodded her head. 5 minutes. Okay, bye! Tally bounced off towards Ophelia and curled her hand into the old woman's. As she was led from the room, she shouted over her shoulder, I love you, my Sarah! Sarah pointedly avoided everyone's eyes as she stood again, cleared her throat, and in comically militant fashion called back, I love you, too. Damn, she's really cramping our style, Sarah, Yarrow said, and Sarah sighed internally. At least she's ridiculously cute while doing it, Lisha added, and Sarah had to admit she agreed with both of them. Refocusing her attention, Sarah looked first to Isadora. What did she say to you? Oh, yes, Isadora said with a chuckle. She informed me that she would be needing a proper lab coat for her next visit to the necropolis. Sarah shook her head and let a low laugh escape. Then she turned to Petra. And you? Petra promptly cleared her throat. I'm afraid that is classified information, Sarah. The frown that dipped Sarah's brow was part bewilderment, part fury. I have top-level clearance, Petra, or need I remind you your position is only temporary? Petra stiffened her spine and straightened out her jacket. You are off duty, thus not privy to top-level security matters. What could a 5-year-old possibly have to say that warrants top-level security? Petra narrowed her eyes at Sarah. Nice try, she said, then cleared her throat again. Now, back to the matter at hand. It is strange, Khalida said as she took Tally's new appearance, to meet someone as a child whom you have already known as an adult. You're telling us, Rael said with a grunt as she tried to hold Tally's wiggling hips still so that Abigail could properly wash the girl's filthy hands. But Tally simply refused to stop dancing in Rael's arms, the song in her head apparently far too delightful to allow her body to ignore. Have you ever seen anything like this before? Abigail asked, as she swatted one of Tally's hands before it could wander outside the room's small bathroom sink and drip soapy water over the floor. I have not, Khalida admitted, standing stoically at the door with her brother just behind, the two merely watching the battle unfold. Pacifists, Rael thought with a roll of her eyes. I did once encounter a potter who had aged himself some 40 years. Rael whipped around, nearly losing her grip on Tally. What? Why would anyone do that? The aged were held in highest esteem then, Khalida said, eyes wandering as if she had become lost in a memory. It was a different time. Slowly, Rael dragged her boggled gaze back to Abigail and muttered, She's like 15, right? Abigail pursed her lips and raised her brows, murmured under her breath, Only on the outside. I'm clean now, Aggie! Tally's screech jarred them back to the moment, and Rael let the girl's feet drop slowly down to the floor again. Abigail patted Tally's hands dry, then nodded her head into the main part of the room they'd been told to wait in. Go sit down, she said, considerably more command than request, and Tally snapped her little legs together like a good soldier and marched towards the blocked exit. Khalida and Adil parted as Tally spilled through, and much to Rael's surprise, Khalida turned and followed right after the girl. What's that about? Rael asked quietly, but Abigail only shrugged. Tally, Khalida said as she joined Tally by the room's lit fireplace. When Tally plopped onto the floor and held her still slightly damped hands out to heat them, Khalida lowered to join her. Tally looked up at her, brown eyes like warm honey in the firelight. She was stupidly adorable, and Rael kind of hated it as much as she loved it. As an adult, Tally's innocence and extremely lame humor, not to mention her ridiculous dimples, made her kind of impossible to say no to. But Tally as a child? Honestly, it just wasn't fair. Rael was half convinced she would happily walk herself off a cliff if tiny Tally Craven pointed to the deadly drop with a smile on her face, saying, "Wait, jump for Tally!" She'd be an absolute goner. So not cool. "Yeah?" Tally said, now chewing on her bottom lip. "Do you know how old you are?" Kalita asked her, and Tally shrugged her wee shoulders. "I'm 5." "Do you know how old you're supposed to be?" Tally frowned and looked up at her, then, 19. The gasp that sounded from Abigail was a sharp wind in Rael's own throat. She she knows?" Rael choked out. "I mean, we knew she had all her memories, but she, like, knows she's not supposed to be 5?" "It would appear so," Adil said, "on some level, at least." Kalita's gaze remained fixed on Tally as she drifted into silence and stayed there, an eerie sort of calm settling over the two of them as they sat together by the fire. And Rael couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow communicating, even if she and the others could see and hear nothing. Rael could only frown as she watched them, still mulling over the idea that Tally knew something was wrong. Yet never once had she acted as if she'd known this or felt it. But then perhaps Kalita was right. Perhaps the knowledge, the awareness, was trapped in some level of Tally's subconsciousness that she couldn't quite or actively tap into. It seemed her body had regressed entirely with the failed unbinding. It only reasoned that most of her mind had as well. There were pockets of knowledge, pieces of her maturity still present, just buried, held back by the limitations of young, regressed organs. The more she thought about it, the more unsettled she felt, and Rael could only hope Tally wasn't trapped in awareness, scared or heartbroken or desperate. She could only hope her friend was as blissfully 5 years old as she appeared. In every way it counted. "She looks like she'd rather be anywhere else right now," Abigail said, shaking Rael from her thoughts. Kalita's expression was as neutral as ever, not a hint of a smile for miles as she sat stock still on the floor and allowed Tally to play with her fingers and the small beaded bracelet she wore. Rael snorted at the sight. "That's perfect, Abs. Now you've got something you can bond with her over, your mutual dislike of children." "Actually," Adil said, his gaze affectionate as he watched his sister's interaction with Tally, "Kalita is rather fond of small children." Both Abigail and Rael whipped around to look at him. Their gazes shot back to Kalita and Tally, then over to Adil again. Um, Rael's frown deepened to an almost cartoonish degree. "That's what she looks like when she enjoys something?" "She is happy, yes," Adil said with a small smile. Abigail and Rael showed a bewildered look as Rael muttered, "I mean, if you say so." The door opened, drawing everyone's attention, and Rael was surprised to see Anacostia standing in the open frame. "Hey, you're up," she said, and Anacostia gave a quick nod as Tally leapt to her feet and raced over. "Rasta!" "I was summoned by the general to assist," Anacostia said, and scooped Tally up with ease. "Hello, sweet girl." "Which general?" Abigail asked, and Anacostia pinned her with a hilariously knowing gaze. "Oh, right. The general who is technically off duty but keeps throwing her authority around like an oversized beach ball?" "Only today," Rael laughed. "She's been cool the rest of the time, but yeah, that beach ball is going wild at this point, just smacking everybody in the face left and right." And Akasha shook her head, a snort of a laugh slipping free. "Well, the beach ball finally landed, so it's time to head out. I was sent over to grab you all." "Cool," Rael said with a nod. "Where we headed?" "The necropolis." "Oh shit," Abigail said. "So, Sarah lost. Yeah. That doesn't bode well." Rael snickered. "So, what does she want to do about Tally?" And Akasha sighed and kissed Tally's temple. A quiet hum, quiet enough that Rael almost missed it, sounded, and a split second later, Tally crumpled in the woman's arms, fast asleep. "Oh shit, yeah. Well, that's definitely effective." "All right, everyone," Anacostia said, resituating Tally in her arms. "Let's head out." She pointed to Adil and Kalita. That includes you two. Follow me.
Kalida's oft harsher tones softened to a delicate, awed whisper that Sarah felt in her own chest.
Goddess protect. Her mother tongue was a reverent kind of music as she moved closer to the thick indigo thread glowing between Sarah's throat and Tally's. Her fingers rose seemingly of their own accord, tips dusting just over the space outside the thread, never touching, only lingering nearby. Still, she seemed affected, as if she could feel the thread's energy simply by being close to it. Have your people seen this bond before? Sarah asked, and the sudden addition of her own voice seemed to jar Kalida from her quiet reverie. She blinked rapidly and regained her composure, dropping her arm to rest at her side as she stepped back and away from the bond again. Her expression fell into its usual emotionless state, but the shaky breath she exhaled told Sarah the girl was rattled. Truly. Kalida gave a short nod. We have, she said, though not in some time. How long? Isadora asked, drawing Kalida's unnaturally wise gaze. But then the girl's eyes were closing as a low hum began to rumble from her throat. Sarah could see her eyes moving behind their lids, rapidly flicking back and forth as if she could see something the others could not, and Sarah understood what was happening. Kalida was accessing her clan's archives, their memories, a hefty but invaluable feat her biddies were capable of as well, thanks to the complexities of the work that bound them to Sarah. What Kalida had access to, however, extended far beyond Sarah's 300 years. When Kalida opened her eyes again, she gave another short nod as if confirming something unsaid. My people have encountered this bond thrice in our history. Only 3 times? Isadora sounded as shocked as Sarah felt. For a clan as ancient as the Tarim, a bond occurring only thrice was astounding. Not even soulmate bonds, like the evergreen thread still visibly dancing about the air between Tally's chest and Sarah's, were that rare, and they were considered one of the rarest bonds amongst which kind? Yes, with the most recent occurring 1,047 years ago. Sarah blinked. Hard. Then blinked again. She glanced to Isadora, who seemed stricken still, unable to blink at all. Isadora, breathe, Sarah said, and Isadora instantly, loudly sucked in a breath. My apologies, she said, and cleared her throat. Her body was still rigid but near trembling, as if she was suddenly so overcome with adrenaline that she didn't know how to express it. So she simply stood there, holding it inside and trying desperately not to make a spectacle of it. The sight both frustrated and amused Sarah. This is all very... She cleared her throat again, and Sarah had to fight not to roll her eyes. Very fascinating indeed. With that limited of an experience, Sarah said, were your people even able to glean any sort of information about the bond? Yes, Isadora said, seeming to find her stride again. Were there any commonalities, anything of note that could help us better define the bond or its properties? Only 2 common factors were noted amongst the 3 occurrences. And those factors were? Sarah did her best to keep her patience, but she had little for people who required constant prompting. She suspected Kalida knew this. The girl was terribly perceptive, and Sarah had never been particularly skilled at hiding her annoyances. With an aggravatingly slow step, Kalida turned her attention back to the bonds connecting Sarah to the 7 women circled around her, as well as to the one small child still sleeping soundly in Rael's lap in a small white lab coat that swamped her frame. Tally had been asleep since before they'd even arrived at the necropolis, but Isadora was anything if not true to her word. Kalida reached out, once again only hovering, and traced the air just outside the white-tainted evergreen thread that bound Sarah's soul to Tally's, and now Tally's soul to the biddies. This, she said, was the first. A soul bond? Isadora questioned, to which Kalida only gave a short nod. So each time you've encountered this bond, Isadora indicated the indigo thread, those affected were also bound as soulmates? Again, Kalida nodded, and Isadora eagerly jotted a note on her pad. And the other factor. Sarah asked, drawing Kalida's disconcerting gaze back to her. The girl tilted her head as if considering something unseen, unspoken. Then, sacrifice. Isadora's eyebrows inched upward. Sacrifice? Yes, Kalida said with a dip of her chin. A prodigious one. Sarah frowned. Meaning? With a heavy sigh, one that made it clear Kalida would rather be speaking to anyone other than Sarah Alder, she looked over the indigo thread again and seemed to regain her interest in being present. She moved near it and hovered her hand just above. Her eyes slipped close, and the barest hint of a smile touched her lips. Do you know the reason my people determined this bond to be so very rare? She didn't wait for a response. Because the kind of sacrifice required to establish it is rarely survived. Isadora's eyes shot so wide they practically bulged. She appeared little more than a breath away from salivating. A life sacrifice? Life, Kalida said. Freedom, something of magnitude. She opened her eyes and lowered her hand to the evergreen thread, allowing one finger to touch it. Sarah felt it, physically, the barest hint of a tug in her chest. But it was gentle, nothing jarring, nothing that caused her concern. To be provided a mate for one's soul is a profound blessing, one we acknowledge and celebrate across all our kind, Kalida continued. It transcends coven and clan, all systems of belief and practice, all things. To be provided a mate with such purity of love that she would offer her life solely for the sake of her bonded, that is the ultimate devotion. She turned her gaze to Sarah. The goddess awards this bond. Her hand returned to the indigo thread, though again, she didn't touch it. To any soul-bonded pair who survives such an act, or, as many of our kind believe, provides an equal measure within the afterlife for those who do not. As Kalida held Sarah's gaze, she began a deep guttural hum that Sarah instantly recognized as work, though she hadn't a clue as to its function. Just as she was about to ask, however, the small tip of Kalida's index finger finally twitched and tapped down against the indigo thread, tying Sarah's vocal cords to Tally's. Sarah gasped hard. Her hand flew to her throat as an awful flood of emotion knotted there like a lump, and suddenly there were tears in her eyes. Her chest ached. Sarah, Isadora, and Rael said at the same time. Then Abigail. Then Anacostia joined in as well, stepping forward from the corner she occupied, standing vigil over the proceedings, also guarding the exit in case Tally managed to free herself by some miracle or work and venture toward horrors unseen. Even the biddies, who didn't seem physically affected in the slightest by whatever ill now ailed their leader, joined in, calling Sarah's name, asking for assurances Sarah couldn't give. She barely had a chance to process the unpleasant sensation, to name it within her own mind, let alone attempt to soothe those calling her name, because right at that moment, Tally woke up. Somehow she jerked awake from her induced sleep with an awful screeching whine that Sarah felt vibrate like overstressed violin strings in her own choking throat. Not a second later, the room began to shake. Tally? Rael gripped Tally like a lifeline, trying to squeeze the panic right out of her. But Tally only latched onto her own throat and chest, clawing at both as if she was trying to reach some phantom pains that were simply unreachable. What is it? What's wrong? The walls rumbled around them as Tally's screech pitched higher. The floor groaned underfoot. The lights flickered overhead before one white, hot bulb in the corner of the room burst, showering glass over a thankfully empty corner. Tears spilled down Tally's cheeks as she shook in Rael's arms and managed a garbled, "So what?" that Sarah was certain would haunt her dreams for weeks to come. "Stop!" Sarah commanded through gritted teeth, finally able to get a word through the grinding sensation in her throat and chest, the vibrations of Tally's terror. But Kalida simply stood, calm as a quiet sea, her gaze fixed on the bond, fingertips still pressed to the thread. The shaking of the room seemed not to affect her at all. I said stop this! Abigail turned towards Adil and bodily shoved him. Fucking make her stop! Adil was as calm as Khalida despite Abigail nearly tossing him off his feet. He clasped his hands behind his back and released a low sigh. Quietly, but with a strange vibration of a hum beneath the name, he said, Khalida. Khalida's eyes snapped up to meet his, and though she pursed her lips as if considering her options, her finger ticked away from the indigo thread, and the uninterrupted song in her throat finally rolled to silence. She took a step back to clear the path as Sarah shot to her feet and crossed the small space between her chair and Rael's. She knew she was being too rough, but she couldn't soften her strength as she yanked Tally off Rael's lap and pressed her against her chest. Tally ringed her legs around Sarah's middle and buried her face in Sarah's neck, clutched her shoulders as if she was afraid that she would fall without an anchor. Her wailing sobs dissipated to muffled whimpers, just small thumps of sound that pricked at Sarah's inside. Sarah, she cried again, still garbled, still haunting, and Sarah squeezed her a little tighter. I have you, my love, Sarah promised, just as she'd done the last time she found Tally in a precarious state, in the goddess-forsaken, as Sarah was beginning to believe, necropolis. Your Sarah is here. She has you. You are safe. Her voice was honey-sweet and music-soft as she cooed into Tally's hair. But when she turned to Khalida, her eyes weren't sweet as all. They burned, and Sarah knew her face was the essence of storm and fury. Her voice was grit and gravel. She was a complete embodiment pressed into a single expression. She wanted to kill this girl, and Sarah hadn't felt such bloodlust in quite some time. How dare you? She growled, and an echoing thunder rolled high above them through layers of stone and dirt. The sound of lightning cracking the grounds of Fort Salem was unmistakable. Sarah couldn't control it. The entire room stood motionless. No breath, no sound. Everyone was frozen, simply watching, waiting to see what Sarah would do, what Khalida would do, what anyone would do, if anything. Sarah could see Anacostia in her peripheral, her hawk-like gaze fixed sharply on her mother, and Sarah knew, if the need arose, Anacostia would attempt to intervene. Sarah wasn't entirely certain that that wouldn't be necessary given the way she was feeling. Khalida, however, seemed utterly unperturbed. She made no move to defend herself, nor speak a word whatsoever. She simply stared up at Sarah in her usual way, expressionless, serene in an unnatural fashion, one that never failed to set Sarah's nerves on edge. The silence was broken only by the girl's brother. The soft clearing of his throat from behind her caused a snap in the tension winding Sarah's spine, and she finally breathed. One long, steadying exhale as she turned to face him. If I may, General, he said, as soft-spoken as ever, my sister meant no harm. Are you fucking serious? Rael's voice split the air instead of Sarah's. She was on her feet now, shaking her head. No, I'm sorry. She sent an apologetic expression Abigail's way. I don't want there to be any trouble. I mean, none of us want that, and I'm really not trying to start anything, but you don't get to stand there and say she meant no harm when Tally was screaming, literally screaming. It was obvious she was in pain or something obviously fucking bad. And Sarah wasn't much better. And she told your sister to stop. And she didn't. How is that not meaning to cause harm? Sarah found herself nodding along to each of Rael's furious words as she cupped the back of Tally's head and bounced her a bit, rocking her from side to side. It was all she could do to keep from tossing out a childish but venomous, yeah! Abigail appeared physically very uncomfortable in the moment, shifting from foot to foot in a nervous fashion unbefitting her name. Either that or she was teeming with adrenaline, though Sarah would have put her money on the former. She could understand. The girl had obviously developed some sort of connection with the Terran boy, but Sarah knew no connection trumped that of these three sisters. You hurt her, Abigail said, tilting her head towards Rael, and her voice was sharp in a way her body wasn't. She looked like the teenager she was, Sounded like the soldier she'd been bred to be. Explain. Sarah was amazed at how these two privates, yet to even begin war college thanks to the unfortunate turn of events during the Tarim recovery mission, had simply taken the lead in a room filled with not only their elders, but their superiors. Normally, Sarah would have told them to mind their place. In this instance, she found she could only feel pride. Pride and gratitude and love. Even Anacostia was puffing up like a proud mother bird. You misunderstand, Adil said, raising his hands in a gentle show of surrender. I apologize. I should have been clearer. Yeah, you should have, Abigail snapped. So do that. If Sarah wasn't still so furious and shaken, she likely would have snorted. She loved the girl fiercely in that moment. The song Khalida sang was an ancient one, Adil told them. One passed through our clan over millennia. It is a song of revelation and requires one's complete concentration. My sister did not intend or ignore any hurts you experienced. She was unaware of them. When I called her name, I layered it with a song of connection, one that allows her to feel me when I am in need of her, and as you witnessed, she regained awareness and ceased her song immediately. Sarah ground her teeth, unsure if she believed the boy, though he certainly sounded sincere, if not a touch too tranquil. Still, she was more than familiar with the kind of powerful seeds and songs that required a witch's complete concentration. She'd performed several herself over the centuries. Tally's pained voice was still a present echo in her ears, however, and she couldn't shake the anger quaking in her bones. The warmth of Tally against her chest, at least, served to soothe. It kept her right on the edge of fury, simmering but never quite coming to a boil. Is this true? She asked as she turned to face Khalida again. Khalida inclined her head, and Sarah did her best to release her anger through a slow, steadying sigh. Was that your aim? Demonstration, Adil answered instead. This bond. Our people have given it a name, though it has not been uttered in many ages. His gaze landed on the indigo thread, growing less and less visible as Isidora's work began to fade from the air. The next words he uttered were wrapped in the comforting, familiar melody of mother tongue, and Sarah barely had time to sink into the sound of it before Isidora's eyebrows shot up, apparently attempting to leave her face entirely as she furiously scribbled another note. Your song, she repeated in English, and Adil confirmed with an almost reverent tilt of his head. As my sister explained, it is immensely rare, and it has only been known to be established by great sacrifices made and survived within soul-bonded pairs. The song Khalida sang was intended to show you how we came to this name, a name to honor a connection not only of souls but of voices, and the power such a connection contains and provides. Voices, Sarah whispered, more to herself than anyone. One hand slipped up to stroke over her own throat just as the last visible bits of the indigo thread slipped from her view like evaporating dye. Adil's nod was serious. The most sacred asset of any witch, he said, and the source of our power. The establishment of this bond means your power is no longer your own, Khalida said, her voice now reverent in a way Sarah hadn't heard before. Nor is Tally's hers. Your voices and the power they generate are now shared, entirely as one, greater than the sum of their parts and capable of the purest, most potent seeds and songs who had ever graced a witch's voice. Tally and Shewa strong, Tally said, and it was so quiet, such a tiny whisper that it traveled no further than the strands of Sarah's loose hair where Tally's lips were buried. All this time, Isadora, and consequently Sarah herself, had believed the immensity of Tally's work at such a young age of development had to have been due to her unconsciously tapping into Sarah's and the Biddy's collective power. In fact, it had been her own all the while. She and Sarah together, their voices now one due to the glowing indigo thread stringing their chords to the other, due to the goddess's rare, precious blessing over Tally Craven's sacrifice for the one and only witch she loved with her entire heart and soul. The realization left Sarah utterly, fucking breathless. So, when Tally offered herself as a biddy, Isadora said, her own lips slightly agape as if she was just as stunned. The sacrifice was deemed worthy, Khalida said, a profound sacrifice of life and vitality to save not only her bonded, but the witches tethered to her bonded as well. And now we are, Sarah said, or rather murmured, more speaking to herself than anyone else. She nudged Tally to pull her back and look into her small tear-streaked face. Sarah stroked her index finger down one cheek and over Tally's chin, then down to her throat, and all the while, Tally simply let her, eyes wide and trusting, small hands still gripping Sarah's shoulders. Sarah felt the thrum of power under her fingertip. Pure song. So strong, Tally whispered, and a sweet smile stretched her lips, putting her dimples on display. Her little hands came up to cup Sarah's cheeks. My Sarah. You must not have noticed the surge in power due to your own already being rather immense, Isadora said, ignoring the affectionate show entirely in favor for her notes. Not to mention the additional surge afforded by the biddy bond. Goddess, Isadora's voice disappeared, drifting to nothing but faint clusters of sound. As Sarah gave the feeling in her chest every ounce of her attention, the awe and gratitude, the sheer magnitude of her love, their love, hers and Tally's. She closed her eyes and tilted her forehead forward, rested it against Tally's. The girl's hand still wound around her cheeks. Thank you, my love, Sarah whispered, and oh, she was overwhelmed with how much she meant those words, how much she felt them. Tally's sweet response was a kiss to the point of Sarah's nose. Welcome. So, of course, while the development and presence of the pure song bond is undoubtedly fascinating, and I certainly intend to study it further, Isadora said, her babbling pulling Sarah back to her awareness, its presence is not responsible for the melding of the soul and biddy bonds. It is not the cause, Khalida confirmed with a barely there nod. It is, however, she turned her gaze to Sarah and held her eyes, the solution. Sarah felt her lips part in surprise. Her eyebrows rose. Just as she was about to prompt Khalida for an explanation, however, the small hands on her cheeks forcefully turned her face back. Sarah's surprise melted to a frown as she looked into Tally's eyes. What is it, darling? Tally leaned in until the tip of her nose was pressed against Sarah's. Her eyes blended into one big brown blob as she drew closer and closer. Then, my Sarah, I need pudding now. A collective laugh ringed the room, Sarah herself joining in. She shook her head fondly between Tally's palms. Can you wait until we are finished here? Dramatic wasn't a strong enough word to describe Tally's guttural, extended sigh. Well, it's just the only thing that makes me feel beau, she said wistfully, and Abigail let out an amused snort. Little shit, she said, and Sarah only laughed a bit harder. She ran a hand gently over Tally's hair and down her back. She's perfect.
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.